Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what Indians are all about.
I still say we Indian people are believers in the truth. This is the way of life that was given to your people. You're born an Indian, you're going to die an Indian. Indianness is a good life. You're facing an Indian this afternoon.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to the Mvskoke Media's weekly press briefing with the executive branch. We have some special guests today joining us to help answer questions and give some info and insights into the CARES Act funding. Joining us is Mr. Jonadev Chowdhury, and I'm not sure where you're tuning in from, Jonadev, but thank you for coming. He is ambassador for the Mvskoke Creek Nation. And as always, we have Mvskoke Creek Nation Press Secretary Jason Salzman and my colleague and favorite reporter, Gary Fife. He's with us today, too. Thank you guys for all joining us today. Thank you.
Mado, it's an honor to be with you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Angel. Always good to be in this format every week and practicing transparent government, being able to talk with the citizens one-on-one and giving an update on the actions of the executive office for the week. And so very good and nice today to have Mr. Chowdhury with us, our ambassador for the nation, certainly a person that I hold in high esteem, and so does a lot of others around Indian country. So it's a real treat for us to have him in this format today. So.
Definitely. I haven't got the pleasure to interview him yet. Some of my colleagues have, and he's always coming with some insightful knowledge for us, and we welcome everybody on board. Jason, can you kind of give us a rundown of your last few days? What's been keeping you busy over at the executive branch? How's it going?
Oh, man. What a great question, Angel. I tell you what, it's been a really quiet past couple days. No, that's not true. we have rolled out just basic information, not really the finalization, because we're still sort of getting all of the application process and online set up ready for the distribution of the CARES Act funding. And the funding, it was a committee process that led us to this final stage. That committee was composed of not only grant professionals, but federal policy experts, commerce executives, and National Council representatives to not only report back to the rest of the National Council on the happenings in the committee, but also to provide citizen input on that committee. So really trying to, and as well as attorneys and Mr. Chowdhury himself, kind of weighing in on not only federal policy, but jury policy, things like that, just really being able to give good input and things like that. So really wanted to make that team up, catching a little bit of every kind of corner of this and what we've got to do as far as following the guidance set forth in this CARES Act, but also, meeting some need and doing some things that we need to repair and rebuild. Certainly a lot of things around the nation that have been hit and been gutted by the coronavirus pandemic. And also meeting immediate need of citizens out there who have, experienced financial turmoil, job loss, financial hardship as a result of the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic. So really just that's a very, very big project. I can't really speak, in appropriate terms on how hard it is to a award of that size with this much to do in this little amount of time, and make sure that you're doing everything that doesn't have the IRS knocking a year now, and making sure that you're good on that end. So very, very big task. And that's kind of the reason I wanted to bring in John today as well, is just kind of get his insight on what it was like being inside of the committee and really the questions that were posed to the committee, and the questions that I think some citizens ask now that maybe would help satisfy some of those questions that are being asked now that were on the inside process, really.
Mhm. So for those of you turning in who are just kind of catching up, last Thursday evening was an extraordinary session where legislation was introduced to council that kind of came with the bones, the kind of, you know, rough outline of how this money would be allocated in the different categories that the tribe prioritized with committee, and they set the funding for those the CARES Act funding allocations, and that was approved through council on Thursday evening. And so since then, there's been lots of citizens weighing in with plenty of feedback, kind of expressing their concerns, and some of them, you know, doing so with expressing disappointment, their concerns, or you know, there's some that think it's fine. But can you kind of really shed the light on some of the guidelines that came with CARES Act funding? That's
Okay.
where I
Yeah.
think I've had a little bit of trouble trying to catch up and understand. It seemed like the documents that were handed down from the Treasury Department were so less comprehensive than even our own legislation to distribute these funds. And can we kind of talk about those guides that the committee was trying to work within, and explain how they come to their conclusions?
Yeah, and I think even communication from the National Congress of American Indians indicated that there was some vagueness. There was some really a lot of up to interpretation, uh, problems that could arise for tribes whenever they look to quickly get these funds and disperse them. And you're having to act quickly, and with the vagueness and a lot of kind of the standards, you look at that and you say that could create problems for tribes because they kind of are waiting for direction here or there. But that's kind of where I was wanting to bring in John, because I think when you look at CARES Act guidelines, the number one guideline is that it must be COVID related, related to COVID-19. That's number one on the list. And so I think a lot of our citizens ask questions like, why does there have to be an application process? Why can't you just send a check, or why isn't just a stimulus, check our enrollment, we're enrolled send a check? And I think, John, we're getting a lot of those questions. So is this kind of where you could chime in and kind of tell us where that doesn't really apply for a tribe such as the Muskogee Creek Nation?
Yes, sir. Well, first, I just want to say, XG, it's an honor to be with all of you here today. I'm honored to join you on this broadcast, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about the CARES Act, what some of the guidelines are in that, and how, at least from an observer's viewpoint, how honored I've been to watch our leadership do the best it could with a very short timeline that was given to it by the federal government. So let's step back a little bit, back to March, when the scope of the pandemic was really starting to be known nationally and bubble up to Congress. In my service as ambassador, I was honored to be privy to a number of the discussions among tribal nations, as well as folks on the Hill, about what type of support, what type of stabilization funding tribal nations would receive as Congress was considering larger stimulus funding and larger stabilization funding. And I want to be very clear that nothing was guaranteed in those discussions. There is no guarantee that $1 was going to go to Indian country in those discussions. We all know there are powerful interests involved, and whenever you talk about federal funding distribution, you have a lot of voices at that table. So I, for one, am very honored to have witnessed the leadership of tribal nations across the country, including our own nation, Mvskoke Creek Nation, to secure funding in the first place. I think that's a very important point to be made. Second, the funding that was secured under Title V of the CARES Act is different than the stimulus funding that individual United States citizens have received. The funding that was received in Title V of the CARES Act was established as an amendment to the Social Security Act to provide relief to states, tribes, and local governments for increased costs associated with COVID. It's very different than individual stimulus funding. This isn't an economic stimulus. Right there in the act itself, it states that these funds are to be, quote, for necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency, meaning the pandemic. Second, those expenditures are not accounted for in the 2020 approved budget of a given state, tribe, or local government. And finally, expenditures must be incurred between March 1st and December 30th. And so if we all recount that funding came in, just a few weeks ago, and the expenses that need to be incurred can only go through December 30th, you have a sense of the urgency to put together a plan that gets funding out for COVID-related expenditures as quickly as possible. So that's a little bit of the background. Treasury has issued a number of guidance documents at different stages of this rollout, none of which provide a very detailed set of explanations about what the funds can be used for and what they can't be used for. Ultimately, because of Indian country advocacy, hard work by tribal leaders and national organizations, a significant amount of funding was received, $8 billion in total, for under Title V of the CARES Act. And it's been kind of released at different stages. Right now, we're talking about the first 60% of the funding. The other 40% is going to be distributed quite differently, or is being distributed quite differently. But the one thing that's clear, even though Treasury hasn't provided very clear guidance, in all of the consultation calls Indian country leaders have had with Treasury, as well as all of their documents, the one main theme that's come out of all of that is that relief needs to be tied to coronavirus expenditures. This can't be a per cap expenditure. I mean, in theory, if you can tie every check in some way to a coronavirus expenditure, that's the best scenario. But in recognizing that, in the interest of time, tribes would have to structure their programs different ways, Treasury unfortunately didn't give a lot of guidance. So Creek Nation, through the development of its committee, did its best to work with Treasury guidance and work through both what were allowable expenditures, and on the other side, what the priorities were of the government, rather than looking at things in a way that the nation couldn't look at them on. I mean, in a way that the nation wasn't allowed to look at them in, namely direct stimulus funding. The Creek Nation government did what it was supposed to do. It evaluated the appropriate priorities in light of coronavirus needs. Now, reasonable minds may absolutely differ as to the various weight of those priorities, how those priorities should have been allotted. And but I do want to just say personally, I've been at least honored to witness the efforts, the painstaking efforts that many on that committee, as well as many others in leadership, have made to do the best job possible, given the circumstances, to try and develop priorities that were consistent with the nation's morals, values, and philosophy. So I'm happy to go into more detail, but I wanted to hit some of those points. This isn't a stimulus funding bill.
Mr. Chaudhary, we were hearing that there was some opposition to tribal participation in this program. Can you clarify that for us and maybe tell us who it was that were raising objections?
Well, let me just clarify first my role. So my role as ambassador was to carry messages to federal leadership, work with other tribal leadership and national organizations to try and secure as much funding as possible for Indian country, but also to get as much clarification possible as far as guidelines. So my participation in our committees and in our discussions has largely focused on, hey, here are the federal guidelines. Here's the best guess about what can be done and what can't be done. As far as priorities go, that those priorities are really matters that have a lot of voices involved in trying to weigh. My hat and my heart goes to anybody who has to develop those priorities. But given the timelines involved, namely that these expenditures only account through expenditures through December, there wasn't, my hat really goes off to the decisive process that people had to undertake. I personally didn't witness any discussions about excluding anybody. I wasn't, it wasn't my role to weigh in on the priorities that should be assigned. But in terms of kind of the process, my role was to share what I could about what the CARES Act allows and to help assist with the process. Certainly in the process, a lot of attention was paid to the timelines involved, as well as the flexibility that if things aren't done 100% right, there is still flexibility to rebudget, and there will be another round of potential funding, and that part of that 40% that's coming down the road that can be allocated then. So some of these funds, the unexpended portions of which can be reallocated, the nation always has an opportunity to reassess its distributions, but more importantly, there will be another round coming up. So I didn't hear anything personally about anybody getting excluded. What I did hear was that we're under the gun because of the federal guidelines that are imposed. And as a community, as a nation, steps have to be taken to figure out how best to leverage existing infrastructures, namely existing program structures, to get the funds out where they're needed the most.
Ambassador, I have a question. So when we looked at those guidelines that were set forth by the federal government, and one of our guests in the chat is also asking this question, the guidelines, you know, we have to kind of, our committee has talked about having to interpret, you know, quite a bit. Is there any indication that that vagueness was to allow flexibility for these tribes and different governmental structures to find the best niche and need for this funding? And like when we are going to report how we've spent this fund, where is this oversight going to be going to on the federal level?
And thank you, Ms. Ellis. I should have pointed that out as I gave my initial recap. In addition to the allowable expenses that Title V of the CARES Act sets forth, it references some oversight safeguards on the back end. Specifically, the act, in a very vague way, authorizes the Inspector General of Treasury to be able to audit any distribution or any use of the funds, and any funds determined to have been spent in violation of Title V must be repaid. So I would absolutely say that the guidelines were written without much guidance, in the hopes, I mean, my hope is this is why they were written this way, but in the hopes that tribes would be able to quickly develop programs, develop grants in a way to distribute funds based on that specific government's needs. But I would caution against interpreting any of that language to say that anything's fair game after that. This wasn't stimulus funding. These were stabilization funds designed to address COVID-related expenditures. And yes, there is flexibility in how tribal nations can allocate those funds, but on the back end, there's oversight by the Inspector General's office with potential repayment with, I imagine, penalties and interests of any inappropriately expended funds. And I could share Oh, I'm sorry, please.
Oh,
go
I
ahead.
was going to say, so for some of the tribes who are choosing to do direct citizen injections of funds, they're going to have to answer for that on the back end. And we're yet to determine whether or not that will be something that the Inspector General is going to say is allowable or not. Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, and I can't speak to any decision making that any tribal nation, other tribal nation engaged in. On a personal level, I very much respect the sovereign status of tribal nations and their ability to make tough calls in a way that suits their own opportunities and needs and aligns with their own levels of allowable risk. But I would say that what one nation does it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best approach for another nation.
For our
John,
specific, oh,
I'm
Yes.
sorry, can I just
Go
jump
ahead.
in right there? Because I think that's a good place to kind of have a small discussion here, because John, not only is he our ambassador, but he is the former chairman of the National Indian Gaming Commission, and so definitely knows tribal nations and their statuses and in regards to their size, their scope, their gaming operations, and what those gaming operations do for those respective governments. So, John, could you? We have a lot of citizens that do say, you know, there was a per cap given from this tribe or this tribe, but in all those cases, it seems to be much smaller, very very small membership, and not many gaming operations, not many programs. But yet, you look at the tribes that are closer to our scope, like the Cherokee Nation, that's rolling out a plan that's very similar to ours. So can you kind of speak to the setup of why certain tribes are service tribes from gaming revenues rather than payments with not many services?
Absolutely. What works for one nation doesn't necessarily work for another. And that's how gaming is set up. And that's how a lot of tribal enterprises are set up. And that's how the rules that apply to those enterprises are set up. Tribal nations should be allowed to develop programming and services in a manner that's consistent with their unique needs and opportunities. With gaming as a backdrop, let me just say, we're what will happen when the audits come that the Treasury Department is authorized to engage in is unknown at this point. We don't know exactly what audits will be done, although an audit of this distribution, I think, can be expected pretty much across the board. And we don't know specifically where Treasury is going to draw that line about necessary expenditures. But we do know things that can be done to minimize the risk to individual citizens, individual grantees, and the nation itself. And that is, the more that you can tie your distributions to actual coronavirus related expenditures, the safer you are, the closer you are to the actual language of the CARES Act statute. Now, individual per capita distributions without any tie-in to specific hardships or specific needs, who knows? Treasury at some point may say that's fine, but those types of payments make it that much harder to say, hey, this really is a stabilization distribution. This really is designed to pay for pandemic related expenditures of the nation or of individual citizens. If you don't have that, it makes it that much riskier. So I'm not going to say tribal nations that have done per caps are going to have to pay all that back. The fact is, it's impossible to read all the tea leaves from the Treasury Department's guidance. Even the biggest national organizations have tried to hold them to the fire to be more specific on many of these points. We haven't gotten full clarity. But the theme that's emerged from all these discussions is if you can tie it to COVID, you should be fine. And so that brings us to how this distribution was set up. I very much appreciate the pressure that and the pain that tribal citizens throughout this land face on a day-to-day basis. And to some degree, we're all impacted by COVID, whether it's knowing people that are impacted, job losses, inflation prices. The priority areas that the committee developed in conjunction with leadership, I think, do go a long way to addressing those various types of hardships. But a general pain is harder to tie to a payment in a way that you can justify through the course of an audit to avoid people or the nation having to return these funds. And it's not, I would go one step further. I mean, there are potential other liabilities beyond repayment that that folks should be mindful of. And so we don't want unintended tax implications for folks who ended up receiving something that doesn't fall in a general welfare exception and getting hit with an unknown tax bill. And I definitely appreciate the pain and the financial pressures that, I mean, we're not a wealthy nation when it comes down to individual members. And so there may be a temptation to look at the full chunk of the award and just do the math and divide by the number of citizens. And to that, I think a couple things could be said. First of all, the CARES Act, there's nothing in the CARES Act that authorizes that. The CARES Act has the requirements that I mentioned before. But second, the general purpose of the CARES Act was to support state, tribal, and local governments to support their members, their citizens, in a way that is consistent with those state, tribal, and local government programs, values, morals, and philosophies. So I think just dividing the number by the number of citizens, it kind of gives short shrift to what a government, any government, our government, any tribal nation's government, or the state or federal governments do. And what they do, or what they're supposed to do, is to provide a support system through programs and services, sometimes grant programs, to figure out how to provide a safety net. And not everybody benefits the same way because not everybody has the same need. And I just wanted to say, just as a witness to the effort and the thoughtfulness that was put into this by others, my role wasn't to serve as a decision maker. My role was to kind of bring back information from DC and information I've heard and working with other tribal nations to help provide the parameters of what can be done and what can't be done. And I don't want to say per cap can't be done, but that's probably we'll see what happens to other nations that went that route.